The day Violet Ashford decided she preferred her own company to anyone else's was the day she buried her father beside her mother in the hard Wyoming soil, and realized that grief had taught her how to breathe alone. Fort Bridger in the summer of 1878 was a town caught between the old ways and the new, where the railroad's promise of progress wrestled with the untamed spirit of the frontier. Violet stood at the edge of her property, watching the dust devils dance across the flatlands beyond her modest ranch. 23 years old, and she had already learned that people left, that promises broke like dry kindling, and that the only reliable thing in this world was the work of her own two hands. Her father had died of pneumonia 3 months back, leaving her with 200 acres, a small herd of cattle, and a reputation in town as the woman who did not need help from anyone. She had not always been this way. Once, she had been a girl who believed in dance halls and courtship, and the kind of love that showed up in dime novels. But her mother's death when she was 16, followed by a failed engagement to a man who decided California gold was more appealing than a Wyoming bride, had taught her that comfort came from within. The past 7 years had been a slow calcification of her heart, a gradual acceptance that solitude was not punishment but sanctuary. The ranch work kept her busy from dawn until well past dusk. She mended fences, hauled water, tended the vegetable garden that sprawled behind the house, and managed the 20 head of cattle with a determination that surprised the neighboring ranchers. They had expected her to sell after her father died, to pack up and move to town, maybe find work as a seamstress or a schoolteacher. But Violet had looked at each of them with those steady gray eyes and told them she was staying. The ranch was hers, and she would make it work. It was a Thursday morning when Vincent Oakes rode into her life, though she did not know it would matter at the time. She was replacing a rotted post in the north fence line, her shirt sleeves rolled up and sweat dampening her collar despite the early hour. The sound of hoofbeats made her turn, one hand instinctively going to the rifle she kept nearby. The man who approached sat easy in his saddle, like he and the horse underneath him were of one mind. He was tall, lean in the way of men who spent their days in hard work rather than excess, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of strong coffee. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, nothing fancy, and there was a carefulness to the way he moved that suggested he understood how a lone woman might feel about a stranger riding onto her property. He stopped his horse a respectful distance away and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, madam. Name is Vincent Oakes. I heard in town you might be looking for a ranch hand." Violet straightened, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "You heard wrong. I am not hiring." The man at the general store seemed to think otherwise. "Said you have been running this place alone since your father passed, and that the work is more than one person can handle. The man at the general store should mind his own business." Her voice was flat, not quite hostile but certainly not welcoming. "I manage fine on my own." Vincent studied her for a moment, and she felt the weight of his assessment. She was used to men looking at her with either pity or speculation, but his gaze seemed different, more measured. "I am sure you do, but there is managing and then there is thriving. I have experience with cattle, horses, fence work, whatever you need. I work hard, I keep to myself, and I am fair with wages. I cannot afford to pay anyone. Room and board, then, and a small wage when you can manage it. I have been on the trail for 2 months and could use a place to settle for a season or two." Violet picked up her hammer, turning her attention back to the fence post. "I said no. I appreciate the offer, but I do not need help." She expected him to argue, to push the way men often did when they thought they knew better. Instead, She heard the creak of leather as he shifted in his saddle. "All right, then. You know where to find me if you change your mind. I will be at the boarding house in town for the next few days." He rode away without another word, and Violet told herself she felt relieved. She had built her life around self-reliance, around the knowledge that she could depend on herself and no one else. A ranch hand, even a respectful one, would disrupt that carefully constructed independence. She had worked too hard to become comfortable in her solitude, to let a stranger with kind eyes undo it. But over the next 3 days, as she struggled to repair the irrigation ditch that fed her garden, as she spent 6 hours wrestling a breach in the fence near the southern pasture, as she lay awake at night calculating how long her savings would last against the mounting expenses, Vincent Oakes lingered in her thoughts. Not because she wanted him to, but because the practical part of her brain kept whispering that pride was expensive, and she could not afford it. On the 4th day, she rode into Fort Bridger just after noon, when the summer sun turned Main Street into a shimmering ribbon of heat. The boarding house sat at the end of the street, a 2-story building with a wide porch where a few men sat smoking and watching the world pass by. She tied her horse to the rail and climbed the steps, her jaw set with determination. The landlady, a woman named Mrs. Hutchins, who had known Violet since she was a child, greeted her at the door with raised eyebrows. "Well, this is a surprise. You here to see someone? Vincent Oakes. Is he still boarding here, room 3, 2nd floor? Though I think he is out back helping my husband with the chicken coop." Mrs. Hutchins gave her a knowing look that made Violet's spine stiffen. "He is a good man, that one. Polite. Hard-working. Several folks in town have tried to hire him, but he said he was waiting to see if a particular opportunity came through." Violet did not respond to that, just nodded her thanks and made her way around the side of the building. She found Vincent in the yard behind the boarding house, stripped down to his undershirt and suspenders, working to reinforce a section of coop fencing. He looked up when he heard her approach, and something that might have been satisfaction flickered across his face. "Miss Ashford, the job is still available if you want it. Same terms you mentioned. Room and board, small wages when I can afford them. I expect a full day's work, and I do not tolerate drinking or gambling or bringing trouble to my property." He set down his hammer and reached for his shirt, pulling it on with efficient movements. "That all sounds fair. When do you want me to start? Tomorrow morning. Be at the ranch by dawn." "I will be there." She should have left then, should have turned and walked back to her horse and ridden home satisfied that she had made a practical business decision. Instead, she found herself hesitating, some part of her needing to set the boundaries clearly. "This is just work, Mr. Oakes. I am hiring you to help with the ranch, nothing more. I am not looking for conversation or companionship or anything beyond a professional arrangement." He met her eyes steadily, and again she saw that careful understanding. "I know that. I am just looking for honest work and a place to stay. I will keep to my own space, do my job, and leave you in peace." "Good. Then we have an understanding." She left before he could say anything else, but as she rode back toward her ranch, she felt an unfamiliar flutter of something in her chest. Not excitement, she told herself, not anticipation. Just the relief of knowing that some of the burden would be shared, that the work might become manageable again. That was all. Vincent Oakes arrived the next morning just as the first light touched the horizon, riding the same steady horse and carrying a worn saddlebag that suggested he traveled light. Violet had prepared the small room off the barn for him, a space her father had used for storage but which she had cleaned out and furnished with a bed, a chair, and a small stove. It was basic but weatherproof, and she told herself that was all a hired hand needed. She met him in the yard and showed him where he could stable his horse, where the water pump stood, where the tools were kept. Her instructions were crisp and efficient, designed to establish that she was the boss and he was the employee. If he found her manner too abrupt, he did not show it. He just listened, asked a few practical questions, and got to work. Those first days established a pattern that Violet found both comfortable and unsettling. Vincent worked from dawn until dusk without complaint, tackling the jobs she assigned with a competence that spoke of real experience. He repaired the irrigation ditch in half the time it would have taken her, reinforced the barn door that had been sagging since winter, and spent 2 full days riding the fence line to catalog every weak point and needed repair. He worked quietly, keeping his distance, eating his meals in his room rather than presuming to join her in the house. It was exactly what she had asked for, and yet it made her oddly irritable. She had grown so accustomed to her solitude that another presence, even one that respected her space, felt like an intrusion. She found herself hyper-aware of him, of the sound of his hammer in the distance, of the way he talked low and gentle to the horses, of the way he sometimes paused in his work to watch the mountains rise purple and majestic to the east. 2 weeks passed before they had a conversation that lasted longer than the exchange of instructions and acknowledgments. It happened on a Sunday evening, when Violet was sitting on her front porch trying to splice a length of damaged rope. She had been working at it for over an hour, her fingers cramping from the effort, her frustration building with each failed attempt. Vincent emerged from the barn, probably heading to his room for the night, but he paused when he saw her struggling. "That rope giving you trouble? I can manage." He hesitated, then climbed the porch steps, keeping a respectful distance. "May I show you a splice I learned from a sailor in San Francisco? It is stronger than the standard method and easier on the hands." She wanted to refuse on principle, but practicality won out. She handed him the rope and watched as his long fingers moved with practiced ease, looping and weaving in a pattern she did not quite follow. He talked her through it, his voice patient, and then handed it back so she could try. It took her 3 attempts, but she finally managed it, and the satisfaction of seeing the clean splice made her grunt approval. "Where did you learn that?" she asked before she could stop herself. "San Francisco, like I said. I worked on the docks for a few months a couple years back. Before that, I was in Texas, and before that, Colorado. I have moved around a fair amount." "Why?" He leaned against the porch railing, his posture relaxed but not presumptuous. "Guess I was looking for something, or maybe running from something, hard to say, but I am tired of drifting. Thought it might be time to stay somewhere for a while, see if I can build something more permanent." "And you chose Fort Bridger. There are bigger towns, more opportunities. I like the quiet, the mountains, the feeling that the world has not quite caught up yet." He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "What about you? Did you ever think about leaving, seeing what else is out there?" The question touched something raw, a dream she had buried years ago. "Once, when I was younger, but this is my home. My parents built this ranch from nothing, and I am not about to let it go just because the work is hard. That is admirable. A lot of people would have given up. Or maybe I am just too stubborn to know when to quit." He smiled at that, a slow curve of his mouth that made him look younger, less guarded. "Stubbornness is an underrated quality. It has gotten me through more than a few rough patches." They talked for another half hour as the light faded and the stars began to prick through the darkening sky. It was the longest conversation Violet had had with anyone since her father died, and she was surprised to find it did not grate on her nerves the way she expected. Vincent had a way of listening that made her feel heard rather than judged, and his stories of his travels had a self-deprecating humor that kept them from sounding like boasts. When he finally said good night and headed to his room, Violet sat alone in the darkness and tried to ignore the small voice in her head that whispered she had enjoyed his company. She reminded herself that comfort in solitude had been hard-won, that opening herself up to another person was a risk she could not afford. But the reminder felt hollow, and she went to bed that night with a restlessness she had not felt in years. The summer deepened, and with it, the rhythm of the ranch. Vincent proved himself invaluable, not just in the work he accomplished, but in the way he anticipated problems before they became crises. He noticed when one of the cows was limping and treated it before the injury worsened. He reinforced the henhouse before a summer storm could tear it apart. He took on the harder physical tasks without being asked, leaving Violet free to focus on the planning and management that kept the ranch running. But more than that, he began to chip away at the walls she had built. It happened in small moments, the kind that seemed insignificant but accumulated weight. He brought her coffee one morning when she was up early checking on a sick calf, somehow knowing exactly how she liked it. He fixed the front step that had been wobbling for months, the one she kept meaning to address but never found time for. He left wildflowers on the porch railing, not in any romantic gesture but simply because he had passed a meadow full of them, and thought they might brighten her day. And slowly, against her better judgment, Violet found herself softening. She started joining him for the evening meal instead of eating alone in the house. She shared stories of her childhood, of her parents, of the ranch's history. She asked about his past, and he answered with an honesty that surprised her, telling her about the mistakes he had made, the people he had disappointed, the long road that had led him to Fort Bridger. "I was not always someone you would want working for you," he admitted one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. "I drank too much, gambled away my wages, got into fights I should have walked away from. Spent a night or two in jail for being stupid and reckless. What changed? I woke up one morning in a town I did not remember riding into, with a black eye and empty pockets, and I realized I was going to die if I kept living that way. Not in some grand, dramatic fashion, just a slow waste of whatever potential I might have had. So I decided to do better. It was not easy, and I stumbled more than a few times, but I kept at it. Found that honest work and a clear head made life easier to bear." Violet absorbed this, appreciating his candor. Most men would not admit to that kind of past. They would try to make themselves sound better than they are. "Most men have not been given the kind of chance you have given me. I figure honesty is the least I owe you." The words settled between them, weighted with meaning she was not quite ready to examine. She changed the subject, asking about his plans for the next day's work, and he let her redirect without comment. But something had shifted, a new level of trust established, and when she went to bed that night, she found herself thinking not about the work that awaited tomorrow, but about the way Vincent's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. August brought a heat wave that turned the landscape brittle and anxious. The small creek that ran through Violet's property slowed to a trickle, and she had to drive the cattle further each day to find adequate grazing. It was exhausting work, and even with Vincent's help, she felt the strain. They rose before dawn and often did not finish until well after dark, collapsing into sleep too tired even to talk. It was during this difficult time that Violet began to realize how much she had come to rely on Vincent, not just for the work but for his steadiness. When she felt overwhelmed by the drought and the worry about whether her herd would survive, he was there with a calm confidence that soothed her fears. When a dispute with a neighboring rancher threatened to escalate, Vincent went with her to negotiate, his presence lending weight to her words. When she pushed herself too hard and nearly collapsed from heat exhaustion, He was the one who made her sit in the shade, brought her water, and quietly took over her tasks for the rest of the day. "You do not have to take care of me," she protested weakly, her head pounding and her vision still swimming. "I know, but someone should, and you are too stubborn to do it yourself. I have been managing alone for a long time. I know that too." He sat beside her, his shoulder not quite touching hers but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "But maybe you do not have to anymore. Maybe it is okay to let someone help carry the load." The words struck something deep inside her, something she had been trying to ignore for weeks. She had spent so long building her independence, convincing herself that she preferred solitude, that needing anyone was a weakness. But sitting there in the shade with Vincent beside her, she felt the carefully constructed walls begin to crack. "I do not know how to do that," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know how to let someone in. You have been doing it little by little. You just have not noticed yet." She turned to look at him, really look at him, and saw in his eyes something that made her heart stutter. He was looking at her not with pity or judgment, but with a warmth that spoke of genuine care, of affection that had grown slowly and steadily over the months. And she realized with a jolt that terrified her that she was looking at him the same way. "Vincent." Her voice cracked on his name. "I know this was not part of the arrangement," he said quietly. "I know you hired me to work, not to complicate your life. But I need you to know that I care about you, Violet. Not as an employer, but as a woman I have come to admire and respect, and if I am being honest, to have feelings for. You do not have to do anything about that information. I will keep working for you, keep respecting your boundaries." But I could not keep it to myself any longer. She should have pulled away, should have reinforced the walls, should have reminded him and herself that she had chosen solitude for good reasons. Instead, she found herself leaning closer, her hand reaching for his. Their fingers intertwined, calloused palm against calloused palm, and the rightness of it made her breath catch. "I am afraid," she confessed. "Everyone I have ever cared about has left me one way or another. I do not know if I can survive that again. I cannot promise I will never leave. Life is too uncertain for that. But I can promise that I will not leave unless you ask me to, and that as long as I am here, I will do everything in my power to show you that you are worth staying for." The tears came unexpectedly, hot and fast, years of grief and loneliness spilling out in a way she had not allowed since her father's funeral. Vincent pulled her close, letting her cry against his chest, his hand gentle on her back. He did not offer platitudes or try to fix her pain. He just held her, steady and sure, and let her feel what she had been holding back for so long. When the tears finally subsided, she pulled back just enough to look at him. His shirt was damp from her crying and she felt embarrassed, but he just smiled at her with such tenderness that the embarrassment faded. "I am a mess," she said, attempting a laugh. "You are beautiful." And then he was kissing her, or she was kissing him, or maybe they met somewhere in the middle. It was not like the few kisses she had experienced as a younger woman, clumsy and uncertain. This was different, a meeting of equals, a promise and a question all at once. His lips were gentle but sure, and she felt the world narrow down to just this moment, just the two of them, just the feeling of finally letting go of the armor she had been carrying for so long. When they finally broke apart, breathless and amazed, Violet felt something shift inside her. The comfort she had found in solitude had been real, but this connection with Vincent felt like coming home to a place she had not known she was missing. It terrified her and exhilarated her in equal measure. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We take it one day at a time. We keep working the ranch. We see where this goes. No pressure, no expectations, just us figuring it out together." I am not good at this, at being with someone. I will probably push you away without meaning to. Then I will be patient. I have gotten pretty good at that. They sat together until the worst of the heat passed, talking in low voices about everything and nothing, learning the shape of this new thing between them. When they finally stood and returned to work, Violet felt lighter than she had in years, as if some burden she had not known she was carrying had been set down. The weeks that followed were a revelation. Violet had forgotten what it felt like to have a partner, someone who saw her not as a project to fix or a conquest to achieve, but simply as a person worth knowing. Vincent courted her in the quiet moments between work, in the way he saved her the best apples from the tree by the creek, in the way he listened when she talked about her dreams for expanding the ranch, in the way he looked at her across the dinner table like she was the most fascinating person in the world. But it was not without challenges. Violet's instinct when things got too close was to retreat, to throw up walls and find reasons to create distance. She picked fights over small things, testing whether he would stay when she was difficult. She tried to reassert her independence by taking on tasks alone that they could have done together. She even suggested once that maybe they should return to a purely professional arrangement, that getting involved had been a mistake. Vincent weathered it all with a patience that astounded her. He did not let her push him away, but he also did not crowd her. When she picked fights, he stayed calm and talked through the real issue underneath. When she tried to prove she did not need him, he let her, but was there to help when she finally asked. When she suggested ending things, he looked her in the eye and said, "I am not going anywhere, Violet. You are scared, and I understand that. But I am not your ex-fiancé, and I am not going to abandon you. So fight me if you need to, but know that I am fighting for us." It was after one of these episodes, when she had spent 3 days barely speaking to him over some manufactured slight, that she finally broke. She found him in the barn one evening, grooming his horse, and the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "Why do you stay?" "I am difficult and stubborn, and I keep trying to drive you away. Why do you not just give up?" He set down the brush and turned to face her fully. "Because I love you, Violet. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you face down every challenge like it is a personal insult. I love the way you care for your animals, the way you talk about your parents like they are still watching over you, the way you pretend you do not need anyone but secretly want connection so badly it hurts. I love you, and that means staying even when you make it hard. Especially when you make it hard." She stared at him, the words sinking in like rain into parched earth. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. No one had ever seen past her defenses to the vulnerable person underneath and chosen to stay anyway. "I love you too," she whispered, the admission feeling like jumping off a cliff. "I think I have for a while now, and it terrifies me. I know, but we will figure it out together." She crossed the space between them and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. He held her tight, and she felt the last of her resistance crumble. She had spent so long being comfortable alone, so long convincing herself that she did not need anyone, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen and loved. Vincent had stayed long enough, had been patient enough, had loved her thoroughly enough that she finally wanted to undo all that careful solitude and let him in completely. September brought cooler weather and the hard work of preparing for winter. There were fences to reinforce, hay to store, firewood to chop and stack. Violet and Vincent worked side by side, their partnership now extending beyond the professional into something deeper. They moved together with an easy synchronicity, anticipating each other's needs, sharing the load in a way that made the work feel less burdensome. The neighboring ranchers began to notice the change, commenting on how well the Ashford ranch looked, how healthy the cattle seemed, how Violet herself seemed different. A few of the older women in town made pointed comments about propriety and appearances, suggesting that it was not quite proper for an unmarried woman to have a single man living on her property. Violet ignored them with the same steely determination she applied to everything else, but Vincent brought it up one evening as they sat together on the porch. "Are people in town giving you trouble about me being here? Nothing I cannot handle." "That is not what I asked." She sighed, setting down the mending she had been working on. "Mrs. Hutchins and a few of the other ladies have made comments about how it looks, me having you here, but I do not care what they think. I care if it damages your reputation, if it makes your life harder." "My life has always been hard, Vincent. I learned a long time ago that people will talk no matter what you do. The only thing that matters is what we know to be true." He was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming against the porch railing in a nervous gesture she had rarely seen from him. "What if we gave them something else to talk about?" "What do you mean, marry me, Violet?" The words hung in the air between them, and she felt her heart stop. She had not thought about marriage, had not let herself imagine a future that permanent. The idea of it filled her with equal parts longing and fear. "Vincent, I know it is fast. I know you value your independence, but I am not asking you to give anything up. I am asking if we can build something together. This ranch, this life. I want to wake up next to you every morning and work beside you every day and fall asleep knowing you are mine as much as I am yours. I want to make this official, not because of what people in town think, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." She looked at him, this man who had ridden into her life when she was most convinced she did not need anyone, who had been patient and kind and steadfast in the face of all her defenses. She thought about the comfort she had found in solitude, how it had protected her but also isolated her. And she thought about the different kind of comfort she had found with him, the comfort of being known and loved and choosing to be vulnerable anyway. "Yes," she said, the word feeling like a leap and a landing all at once. "Yes, I will marry you." His face lit up with a joy so pure it made her chest ache. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that left them both breathless. When they finally broke apart, he was laughing, and she found herself laughing too, the sound strange and wonderful after so long holding herself back. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Fort Bridger. Violet wore a dress she had sewn herself, pale blue with white lace at the collar, and carried wildflowers that Vincent had picked that morning. There were not many guests, just a few neighboring ranchers and townspeople who had known Violet since childhood. But their presence felt right, a small community bearing witness to this new beginning. When the preacher asked Vincent if he took Violet to be his lawfully wedded wife, his "I do" rang out clear and sure. And when Violet spoke her own vows, promising to love and honor and partner with this man who had changed her life, she meant every word with a ferocity that surprised her. The kiss at the end of the ceremony was chaste and brief, appropriate for the public setting, but the promise in Vincent's eyes told her there would be time later for more. They rode back to the ranch together in the wagon, Violet's hand clasped in Vincent's, the autumn sun warm on their faces. That night, after the simple celebration dinner they shared with a few friends, after the last guest had departed and the house fell quiet, Vincent carried Violet across the threshold of the house that was now officially theirs together. He set her down gently in the bedroom, his hands tender on her waist, his eyes asking a question she answered by pulling him down into a kiss. Their lovemaking that night was both exploration and affirmation, a physical expression of the emotional journey they had traveled together. Vincent was patient and attentive, learning what made Violet gasp, what made her arch into his touch, what made her whisper his name like a prayer. And Violet, who had held herself back for so long, let herself be fully present, fully vulnerable, fully alive in a way she had not allowed herself to be in years. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, Violet's head on Vincent's chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For staying, for being patient, for loving me enough to undo all the walls I built." He kissed the top of her head, his arms tightening around her. "Thank you for letting me, for trusting me with your heart. I promise I will take care of it. I know you will." The first year of their marriage was a period of adjustment and growth. They learned the rhythms of living together, of navigating not just as partners in work, but as husband and wife. There were moments of friction, times when Violet's old instincts toward independence clashed with the reality of being part of a team. There were times when Vincent's patience wore thin and they argued, their voices sharp in the quiet of the house. But they also learned to fight fair, to talk through their differences, to apologize and forgive and move forward. They learned that love was not just the heady passion of those early days, but also the choice to show up day after day, to do the work of understanding each other, to build something that could weather the inevitable storms. The ranch thrived under their joint management. Vincent's experience and Violet's determination made them formidable, and by the end of that first year, they had managed to increase their herd, improve their grazing land, and even set aside a small amount of savings. They talked about the future, about possibly buying more land, about building a larger house, about all the ways they could expand and grow. It was in the spring of their second year together that Violet realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, the subtle changes in her body and the persistent morning sickness providing clues, but she waited until she was certain before telling Vincent. She found him in the barn one evening, and the words tumbled out with less grace than she had planned. "I am going to have a baby." He froze, the pitchfork in his hands hovering mid-air, and then slowly set it down. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor. All the signs are there." He crossed to her in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, his face buried in her hair. She felt him trembling and realized he was crying, tears of joy and wonder soaking into her collar. "We are going to have a baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Violet, we are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly needing to hear him say it. He pulled back to look at her, his face wet but radiant. Happy does not even begin to cover it. Terrified, amazed, grateful, all of that too. But yes, so incredibly happy. They drove to Fort Bridger the next day to see the doctor, who confirmed what Violet already knew. She was about 3 months along, the baby due in early autumn. The doctor gave her instructions about rest and nutrition, warnings about the dangers of overwork, and advice she only half listened to because she was too busy watching the awe on Vincent's face. Pregnancy changed things in ways both expected and unexpected. Violet had to reduce her physical labor, a concession that chafed against her independent nature, but which Vincent insisted on. He took over the heavier tasks, hired a temporary hand to help with the summer work, and fussed over her in ways that were both endearing and occasionally annoying. But she also found herself softening even further, her body changing to accommodate this new life inside her, making her more aware of her own vulnerability. She let Vincent care for her, accepting his help with a grace that would have been impossible a few years earlier. She let herself imagine a future not just as a rancher and a wife, but as a mother, part of a family that she and Vincent were building together. The baby, a girl they named Vera, arrived on a cool September evening with the first stars just beginning to appear in the sky. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Violet was certain she could not go on. But Vincent was there beside her the entire time, holding her hand, whispering encouragement, being the steady presence she needed. And when the midwife finally placed the squalling, red-faced infant in her arms, Violet felt something shift in her heart, an expansion of love she had not known was possible. Vincent looked at his daughter with such wonder that Violet started crying again, overwhelmed by the beauty of this moment. "She is perfect," he whispered, his finger gently stroking the baby's tiny hand. "She is absolutely perfect." "Just like her father," Violet said, and meant it. The first months of parenthood were exhausting and exhilarating. Violet struggled with the identity shift from independent rancher to mother, sometimes feeling trapped by the demands of an infant. But Vincent was a devoted father, rising in the night to help with feedings, walking the floor with Vera when she was fussy, changing diapers without complaint. He approached fatherhood with the same steady determination he brought to everything else, and watching him with their daughter made Violet fall in love with him all over again. As Vera grew from infant to toddler, Violet found herself marveling at the life they had built. The ranch continued to thrive. They had a healthy, happy daughter, and she and Vincent had developed the kind of partnership that made every challenge easier to bear. She thought sometimes about the woman she had been when he first rode onto her property, convinced she was better off alone, comfortable in her solitude. That woman felt like a stranger now, and Violet could barely remember why she had been so determined to keep everyone out. When Vera was 2, Violet found herself pregnant again. This time the news was met with excitement rather than shock, a natural progression of the family they were building. Their son, Victor, arrived the following spring, a robust baby with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes. Watching Vincent with both children, seeing the gentle way he taught Vera to be a big sister, the patient way he rocked Victor to sleep, Violet felt her heart so full she thought it might burst. Life settled into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and dynamic. The ranch work continued, adjusted now to accommodate 2 small children. Violet managed the business end, keeping the books and making decisions about stock and sales, while Vincent handled the physical labor with the help of a couple of hired hands. They worked together in the evenings after the children were asleep, planning and strategizing, their partnership as strong in business as it was in their personal life. Fort Bridger changed around them as the years passed. The railroad brought more people, more commerce, more of the modern world encroaching on the frontier. But on their ranch, time seemed to move at a different pace. They raised their children with the values that mattered to them, teaching Vera and Victor about hard work and honesty and the importance of community. They hosted neighbors for dinners and helped when others faced hardship, and built a life that felt meaningful and full. One evening, when Vera was 7 and Victor was 5, Vincent and Violet sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard. Vera was showing Victor how to catch fireflies, their laughter bright in the gathering dusk. Violet leaned against Vincent's shoulder, his arm warm around her, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. "You ever regret it?" Vincent asked quietly. "Giving up your independence, letting me stay?" Violet thought about it, really considered the question. She thought about the woman she had been, hard and closed off, convinced that comfort could only be found in solitude. She thought about the fear that had kept her isolated, the pain that had taught her to rely only on herself. And then she thought about everything that had come after Vincent stayed, the love and partnership and family they had built together. "No," she said firmly. "I do not regret a single moment. I thought I was comfortable alone, and maybe I was in a way. But this life with you, with our children, it is so much richer than anything I could have built by myself. You stayed long enough for me to realize that letting you in was not weakness. It was the bravest thing I have ever done." He kissed her temple, his voice rough with emotion. "You made me believe I could be more than my mistakes. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. I was drifting when I found you, and you gave me a reason to stay. We saved each other, I think. I think you are right." They sat together as the stars came out one by one, watching their children play, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. The cattle lowed in the distance, the horses shuffled in the barn, the creek whispered its endless song. This land that Violet had fought so hard to keep was now truly theirs, a legacy they would pass on to their children. The years continued to unfold, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, celebrated good harvest years, and struggled through lean ones. They watched their children grow, Vera into a strong-willed young woman who shared her mother's determination and her father's kindness, Victor into a thoughtful boy who loved the land with the same passion his parents did. When Vera was 16, a young man from a neighboring ranch began courting her, and Violet watched with a mixture of pride and wistfulness as her daughter navigated the same questions of love and vulnerability that she had once faced. She pulled Vera aside one evening and told her the story of how she had met Vincent, how she had been so determined to stay alone, how he had stayed long enough to make her want to undo all that careful isolation. "I was terrified," Violet admitted. "Of getting hurt, of being left, of needing someone and having them disappear. But your father taught me that love is worth the risk, that being vulnerable is not weakness, it is courage, and that the right person will stay even when you make it hard." Vera listened with wide eyes, seeing her mother in a new light. "Were you really that closed off?" "I was. I had convinced myself I was fine alone, that I did not need anyone. And then your father showed up and was patient and kind and persistent, and he made me realize that I was not living, I was just surviving. He made me want to truly live again." "I think I understand," Vera said softly. "I have been scared, too, of letting James get too close. But he makes me happy in a way I did not know was possible. Then do not let fear rob you of that happiness. If he is the right one, if he treats you with respect and love and stays even when things are hard, then hold on to him. Life is too short to spend it alone when you could share it with someone who makes it better." Violet watched over the next few years as Vera and James built their own relationship, eventually marrying in a ceremony that reminded Violet so much of her own wedding that she cried through the entire service. Victor too found love, with a schoolteacher who moved to Fort Bridger and captured his heart with her intelligence and gentle spirit. As Violet and Vincent entered their later years, their children grown and starting families of their own, they found a different kind of comfort in each other. The passion of youth had mellowed into a deeper intimacy, the kind that came from decades of shared experience, of weathering storms together, of building a life that meant something. They still worked the ranch, though with more help now, and they still sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains they both loved. "You remember the first day you rode onto my property?" Violet asked one evening, her hair now streaked with gray, her hands marked with the calluses of a lifetime of work. Vincent, his own hair silver and his face lined with the years, smiled at the memory. "I remember thinking you were the most stubborn woman I had ever met, and the most beautiful. I tried so hard to drive you away, I know, but I was not going anywhere. I knew from that first conversation that you were worth staying for." "How did you know?" "I was not exactly welcoming. because I saw past the walls to the woman underneath. I saw your strength and your vulnerability, your fierce independence and your secret longing for connection. And I saw someone who had been hurt and was determined never to be hurt again. I recognized that because I had been there myself. So I decided to stay, to be patient, to show you that not everyone leaves. Violet reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. You changed my life, Vincent Oakes. You made me believe in love again. You made me want to be vulnerable, to let someone in, to build something beautiful together. I had gotten so comfortable alone, and you stayed long enough to make me want to undo all of that. And you gave me a reason to stay in one place, to build a home, to become the man I always wanted to be. We saved each other, Violet. We built something extraordinary together. They sat together as the last light faded from the sky, two people who had found each other at just the right time, who had chosen love over fear, who had built a life that would endure long after they were gone. The ranch that Violet had once worked alone now thrived under the management of their children, a legacy of love and partnership that would continue for generations. As the stars came out, brilliant and infinite in the Wyoming sky, Violet reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the young woman she had been, convinced that solitude was safety, that needing no one was strength. She thought about how Vincent had patiently and lovingly shown her a different way, had stayed when others would have left, had loved her thoroughly enough to undo all her careful defenses. She thought about their children and grandchildren, about the family they had created, about the love that had started with one cowboy who rode onto her property and refused to give up on a stubborn woman who thought she was better off alone. She thought about all the moments, big and small, that had brought them to this point, sitting together in the comfort of a love that had been tested and proven true time and again. "I love you," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of decades. "I love you too," Vincent replied, as he had countless times before and would countless times again. Always. And there, on the porch of the ranch they had built together under the vast Wyoming sky, Violet Ashford Oakes knew with absolute certainty that letting Vincent stay, letting him into her heart, letting him undo her comfortable solitude, had been the best decision of her life. She had learned that sometimes the greatest courage is not in standing alone, but in allowing yourself to be loved, to be vulnerable, to be part of something greater than yourself. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the scent of sage and earth and home. And Violet, who had once believed comfort could only be found in solitude, smiled and held tight to the hand of the man who had taught her otherwise, grateful for every moment, every challenge, every joy that had brought them here together. Their story was not one of dramatic rescue or grand gestures, but of steady devotion, of choosing each other day after day, of building a life together one moment at a time. It was a story of a woman who had gotten comfortable alone, and a cowboy who stayed long enough to make her want to undo that. And in the undoing, they had both found something more beautiful than either could have imagined. As the years continued to pass, their love only deepened, mellowing like fine wine, becoming richer and more complex with age. They faced the challenges of growing older together with the same partnership that had defined their entire marriage, supporting each other through aches and pains, through the slower pace that came with time, through the bittersweet joy of watching their children and grandchildren build their own lives. When Violet was 72, she suffered a fall while working in her garden, breaking her hip in a way that required months of recovery. Vincent became her nurse, her companion, her constant support, just as he had been throughout their entire marriage. He helped her with physical therapy exercises, read to her when she was restless, sat with her through the long nights when pain kept her awake. And when she finally recovered enough to walk again, he was there holding her hand, celebrating each small victory as if it were a triumph. "You have been taking care of me for months," Violet said one day as they slowly walked the perimeter of their property, her hand on his arm for support. "I feel like I have become a burden." Vincent stopped and turned to face her, his aged but still handsome face serious. "You could never be a burden to me, Violet. You are my partner, my love, my whole heart. Taking care of you is not a duty, it is a privilege. Just as you took care of me all those years ago when I had the fever, remember? And after I broke my arm in that storm, we take care of each other. That is what love is." She leaned against him, grateful for his strength, grateful for the decades they had shared, grateful for the decision she had made all those years ago to let him stay. "How did I get so lucky?" she whispered. "I think I am the lucky one. I was a drifter with no home and no purpose, and you gave me everything that matters. You gave me a life worth living." They continued their walk, moving slowly but together, two people who had weathered every storm life threw at them because they faced it side by side. The ranch was quieter now, managed primarily by their son Victor and his family, but it still felt like home. The house held decades of memories, the land bore the mark of their stewardship, and every corner held echoes of the life they had built. Their 75th wedding anniversary was a grand celebration, with children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren gathering at the ranch to honor the couple who had built this legacy. There was music and dancing and feasting, laughter and tears and stories shared. Vera stood up to make a toast, her own hair gray now, her own children grown. "My parents taught me what real love looks like," she said, her voice carrying over the assembled crowd. "Not the easy kind you read about in books, but the hard kind, the kind that requires work and compromise and choosing each other even when it is difficult. My mother was a woman who had learned to be alone, who had built walls to protect herself. And my father was a man who stayed, who was patient, who loved her enough to help her tear down those walls. Together, they built something extraordinary. They built a family, a home, a legacy of love that will endure for generations. So please join me in celebrating Vincent and Violet Oakes, two people who prove that true love is not just about grand gestures but about showing up, day after day, year after year, and choosing each other over and over again." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and Violet wiped tears from her eyes as Vincent squeezed her hand. They stood together, these two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life that exceeded their wildest dreams, who had proven that love could overcome fear and heal old wounds and create something beautiful and lasting. As the celebration continued around them, Violet looked at Vincent and saw not just the old man he had become, but the young cowboy who had ridden onto her property all those years ago. She saw every version of him she had known, every moment they had shared, every challenge they had overcome. And she knew with absolute certainty that she would do it all again without changing a single thing. "Thank you," she said quietly, just for him. "For what?" he asked, as he had so many times before. "For staying, for being patient, for loving me enough to undo all my defenses and show me what life could be. For giving me this beautiful family, this wonderful life, this extraordinary love, for everything." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, his eyes wet with happy tears. "The pleasure has been all mine, my love, all mine." They stayed at the celebration for hours, surrounded by the family they had created, the legacy they had built. And when they finally retired to their bedroom that night, exhausted but happy, they lay together in the darkness, hands clasped, hearts beating in rhythm after all these years. You think we did it right? Violet asked sleepily. This life we built. I think we did our best, and our best created something pretty wonderful. Look at our children, our grandchildren. Look at this ranch, this home. Look at us, still here, still together after all these years. I would say we did more than right. We did extraordinary. Violet smiled in the darkness, feeling the weight of his arm around her, the familiar warmth of his body beside hers. She thought about the solitary woman she had been, the walls she had built, the comfort she had found in being alone. And she thought about how Vincent had gently, patiently, lovingly dismantled those walls, brick by brick, day by day, until she was standing vulnerable and open and more alive than she had ever been. She had gotten comfortable alone, had convinced herself it was enough. But Vincent had stayed long enough to show her it was not, to show her that there was a whole world of connection and love and partnership she had been missing. He had stayed long enough to make her want to undo all that careful solitude, and in the undoing, they had both found their truest selves. As she drifted off to sleep, Violet felt a peace that went bone deep. This was what she had been meant for all along, not solitude but partnership, not independence but interdependence, not comfort but joy. Vincent had given her all of that and more, and she had given it back to him in equal measure. They had saved each other, completed each other, and built a love that would echo long after they were gone. The ranch continued to thrive under their family's stewardship. The land they had fought so hard to keep now passed down to children and grandchildren who understood its value. The house they had filled with love and laughter continued to shelter new generations, its walls holding memories of everything they had built together. And in Fort Bridger, the story of Violet and Vincent Oakes became the kind of legend that people told to illustrate what real love looked like, the kind that lasted, the kind that mattered. Years later, when they were both gone, their descendants would still gather at the ranch for holidays and celebrations. They would walk the land their great-grandparents had worked, sleep in the house they had built, and tell stories about the stubborn woman who had gotten comfortable alone and the patient cowboy who had stayed long enough to change her mind. They would talk about the love that had started it all, the partnership that had built an empire, the devotion that had lasted a lifetime. But on that anniversary night, with decades of marriage behind them and whatever time remained ahead of them, Violet and Vincent simply lay together in the darkness, grateful for every moment, every challenge, every joy they had shared. They had found each other when both needed it most, had built something beautiful together, and had proven that sometimes the greatest adventure is not in standing alone but in allowing yourself to fall in love. The Wyoming wind whispered through the open window, carrying the scent of sage and pine and home. And Violet Ashford Oakes, who had once been so certain she was better off alone, smiled and held tight to the hand of Vincent Oakes, the cowboy who had stayed long enough to teach her otherwise, grateful for every single day of the life they had built together. Their story was complete, a circle closed, a promise fulfilled. From that first day when Vincent rode onto her property to this moment lying beside him in the home they had made together, Violet had traveled a journey from isolation to connection, from fear to love, from comfortable solitude to joyful partnership. And she would not trade a single moment of it for anything in the world. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not the size of the ranch they had built or the number of cattle they had raised or the money they had saved. What mattered was the love they had shared, the family they had created, the life they had built together one choice at a time. What mattered was that Vincent had stayed when others would have left, that Violet had opened her heart when every instinct told her to close it, that they had chosen each other over and over again through all the years and challenges and joys. As dawn broke over the Wyoming landscape the next morning, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Violet woke in Vincent's arms and knew, as she had known every morning for the past 50 years, that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Not alone, not isolated, not protected behind walls of her own making, but here, vulnerable and open and deeply, completely loved. She had gotten comfortable alone, but Vincent had stayed long enough to make her want to undo that. And in the undoing, they had both found everything they had ever needed. That was the true magic of their story, the simple truth that love, real love, was worth every risk, every fear, every moment of vulnerability. It was worth staying for, worth fighting for, worth building a lifetime around. And as the sun rose on another day in the life of Violet and Vincent Oakes, they faced it together, as they always had and always would. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something extraordinary from nothing more than patience, devotion, and a love that refused to give up. The end came for them together, as it should have, many years later. They died within days of each other, Vincent first, and then Violet, unable to imagine life without the man who had been her partner for over half a century. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the wide Wyoming sky they had both loved so much. Their tombstone was simple, bearing their names and dates and a single line that captured the essence of their story. They chose each other, every day. And that was the truth of it, the simple, profound truth that had defined their entire lives. They had chosen each other when it would have been easier to walk away. They had chosen love when fear would have been safer. They had chosen partnership when solitude would have been more comfortable. And in making those choices, over and over again through the decades, they had built a love story that would inspire generations to come. A testament to the power of staying, of patience, of loving someone enough to help them tear down their walls and step into the light. Violet had gotten comfortable alone, but Vincent had stayed long enough to make her want to undo that. And in that undoing, in that brave, vulnerable choice to let him in, they had both found the truest, deepest, most meaningful love either of them could have imagined. That was their legacy, the gift they left to their children and grandchildren and all who came after. The knowledge that real love is worth the risk, worth the vulnerability, worth the choice to stay even when it is hard. And so their story ended, not with sadness but with fulfillment, not with regret but with gratitude, not with fear but with the peace that comes from a life well lived and a love well shared. They had built something beautiful together, something that would endure long after they were gone, and that was more than enough. That was everything.